Hi. In the last video, we looked at the various principles and fundamental concepts of hot standby feature on the firewall. In this video, we are going to look at the different application scenarios which we can have when we are using the hot standby feature. As you already know that we can either have the firewall service interfaces at layer 2, or we can have the firewall service interfaces working at layer 2. Either we can have them at layer 3 or we can have them at layer 2. So these are the two scenarios in which we can implement the firewall, or we can have a third deployment scenario firewall as well, which we call the offline deployment. In case of firewall working at layer 3, we can either have, these are the two scenarios of inline deployment. We can either have the upstream and downstream connectivity of the firewall with switches. We can have upstream and downstream switches, or we can have the upstream and downstream routers, or we can have upstream routers and downstream switches. In case of transparent deployment or with firewall service interfaces acting as layer 2 interfaces, we can have the upstream and downstream routers. And in case of offline deployment, we can also call this out of path deployment. We use layer 3 switches for diverting traffic towards the firewall. Let's take a look at these scenarios one by one. The first scenario is when we have our two firewalls and they are connected to switches on the downstream as well as on the upstream. So we have upstream and downstream switches. In this situation, as you can see, the upstream and downstream service interfaces, the upstream and the downstream service interfaces of the firewalls, they work at layer 3. These are layer 3 interfaces, and they are connected to layer 2 switches on both sides. We have static routes which forward the traffic from the firewall towards this intranet. In this case, we simply implement the VRRP configuration. We do the VRRP configuration and we implement VRRP groups both on the upstream side and on the downstream side. Then we configure VGMP and we do the necessary HRP configuration between the firewalls. These are the HRP interfaces, or this is the HRP connection or the heartbeat connection between the two firewalls. Using this connection, the two firewalls are going to exchange the HRP configuration information and the HRP status information. And we implement the static route, which is actually going to be used for forwarding the traffic towards the intranet. In the next scenario, we have upstream routers and downstream routers between the firewalls. We have the two firewalls and we have routers on both sides of the firewalls. In this case, we will be running OSPF between the firewalls on the routers on this side, as well as OSPF between the routers and the firewalls on this side. In this case, we cannot run VRRP. However, we are going to use HRP to track the interfaces, and then depending upon the status of any interface, we can do the switching over of the firewall from active firewall to the standby firewall. And in the third scenario, we can have routers on this side and we can have the switches on this side. In this case, what we can do is that, in this case, you can see that we configure OSPF for the firewalls to communicate with the routers on this side. And then we configure what we call the link groups. We have not covered link groups so far. We'll be discussing them in the next video. And in this scenario, if we have routers on one side and switches on the other side, we do the switching over based on the status of link groups. We configure link groups on the firewalls, and based on the status of any link group, we can switch the traffic from this active firewall to the standby firewall. So in this scenario, instead of using HRP track interface, we use the link group feature. And then coming to the next scenario, in which we have firewalls acting as transparent devices, which means that their service interfaces are acting as layer 2 interfaces. We use the HRP track VLAN feature to make sure that if one of the interfaces or one of the VLANs is not available, the firewall can switch traffic through the active firewall can ask the standby firewall to take over, and the traffic can then be forwarded through the standby firewall. And this instruction or this information is exchanged using the HRP interface or the HRP link, which we also call the keep alive link. And the last scenario is when we talk about the offline deployment. In offline deployment, you can see that the firewalls are not connected in the line or in the path of the traffic flow. However, we have two layer 3 switches in the path of traffic flow. The traffic going from the intranet towards the external networks or the internet is exchanged through these layer 3 switches. And these layer 3 switches are connected to these two firewalls, and these firewalls also have a heartbeat link or a keep alive link through which they can exchange the HRP information with each other. In this situation, what happens is that these layer 3 switches are running OSPF with the routers or with these switches, and they're also running OSPF with these firewalls. And in order to forward traffic towards these firewalls, we have policy-based routing or PBR configured on these switches. So whenever traffic is going from the intranet towards the internet and it tries to pass through these layer 3 switches, we have configured policy-based routing on these switches. These switches forward the traffic using the PBR. They forward the traffic towards the firewall. The firewall receives the traffic, checks the traffic against the different firewall rules that we have implemented on these firewalls, and then sends the traffic back through another link towards the same switch. And then this traffic is forwarded towards the external networks or towards the internet. And once the return traffic comes towards this switch, the switch once again forwards this traffic using policy-based routing towards the firewall, and the firewall checks that traffic, and if the traffic is allowed to pass through, it is forwarded back to the switch, and the switch can then forward this traffic towards the destination. So this is how this out-of-path feature works, or out-of-path deployment or offline deployment works between the firewalls. So this is how this happens. And one important thing that we need to understand is that we need to have two separate OSPF processes running on these firewalls and on these switches, and we need to do mutual redistribution between those two OSPF processes. So this is a unique scenario or a unique implementation configuration which we need to keep in mind, where we have to run two OSPF instances and then we redistribute those OSPF processes or instances into each other. So the different configuration or additional configuration that we need to do on the switches is the policy-based routing and multiple OSPF processes, and similarly we need to implement multiple OSPF processes on the firewalls. The rest of the configuration is fairly similar to whatever we have seen and done for previous implementations of hot standby. So this is the same concept shown slightly differently. As you can see, the traffic coming from the, for example, the router to the layer 3 switch, going to the firewall, coming back to the same layer 3 switch and going towards the intranet, or the traffic going from the intranet towards the internet is passing through the layer 3 switch, going to the firewall, then coming back to the same layer 3 switch, this is the same layer 3 switch, and then going towards the internet. If you look at the configuration in this situation, you can see that you configure HRP track interface gigabit Ethernet 1/0/0 and gigabit Ethernet 1/0/1. These are the two interfaces which are connecting the firewall to the layer 3 switch. Then we implement HRP just OSPF cost enable, which means that if one of the interfaces is not available, then the firewall can switch traffic through the other interface, or firewall can switch traffic to the other firewall. And then we do the HRP, configure the HRP interface, which is gigabit Ethernet 1/0/7. This is the heartbeat interface, or this is the interface, HRP interface, which is being used for exchanging the HRP updates or HRP configuration and session information between the firewalls. Then we enable HRP on the firewall. Then we configure HRP track interface. This is for firewall B. On firewall B as well, we configure the HRP track interface, gigabit 1/0/0 and 1. And then we configure this firewall as HRP standby device. We adjust USPF cost, and then we define the HRP heartbeat interface as 1/0/7. And then we enable HRP. Similarly, if you look at the OSPF configuration, you will see that you have created two OSPF processes, OSPF 100 and OSPF 200, and apart from doing the other necessary OSPF configuration, which is the basic configuration, we finally do the mutual redistribution between OSPF 100 and OSPF 200. So you can see that import route OSPF 200 and import route OSPF 100 is doing, these two commands are doing a mutual redistribution between OSPF processes 100 and 200. And finally, on switches, we also have to do the policy-based configuration. In order to do policy-based configuration or policy-based routing configuration, PBR, we define the ACL, for example, 3000 in this case. We do the necessary configuration against the ACL, the traffic that we want to test or we want to divert towards the firewall. Then we define the traffic classifier, we define the traffic behavior, we link the ACL to the traffic classifier and define the next stop of the firewall in the traffic behavior configuration, and then we combine the two in the traffic policy, the classifier and the behavior. We combine the two, or we call both of them in the policy, and then we implement the policy on the interface, on the relevant interface from which the traffic is being received. So this is how we do the configuration of hot standby, or we do the configuration of out of path or offline deployment of firewall within our infrastructure. And generally this configuration is done, offline deployment is done when we are doing an active deployment. That's generally where we would like to do this. So this was about hot standby. In the next video we are going to look at we are going to take a look at the link group feature and the Ethernet trunk feature, which are the last two features for this module. So see you in the next video.